The Alliance for WPS project, as presented by Andrea, focuses, amongst others, on how the implementation of the women, peace and security agenda is taken forward, both in the Swiss context as well as in context abroad, and how the expertise of civil society is or can be included in the process of the elaboration as well as during the implementation of the National Action Plan. Another crucial pillar of the project, which was also already mentioned by Andrea, is the aim to promote learning and exchange between South African and Swiss civil society. This, of course, also in view of the shared chairmanship of the WPS focal point network, during which, during the co-chairmanship of South Africa and Switzerland, the priorities were set to be participation and project protection, as well as possibilities for involving civil society. Giving this background and also South Africa's valuable experience in transitional justice processes, these meaning women's participation, civil society inclusion, and dialogue between South Africa and Switzerland around issues of transitional justice were the key aspects or the starting points for the thematic design of this webinar. In conversation with today's speakers, all with their specific area of expertise, the common thread that stood out when talking about participation, inclusion, and processes of transitional justice in different contexts was the lack thereof, meaning the negating or the exclusion of certain experiences, certain voices and expertise when it comes to dealing with past and current legacies of violence, as well as the lack of understanding or the failure of inclusion, which then leads to reproduction of violence and injustice again and again. In their respective contexts, Switzerland, South Africa, Uganda, or Brazil, the three expert speakers, Jaliwe Clark, Helen Scanlon, and Izabel Barros, examine the production of public memory and counter-narratives, the failings of processes of dealing with the past and its consequences on affected people, as well as the colonial feminist perspectives on what peace means and what it could look like. The term transitional justice, as we applied during today's webinar, thus goes beyond a strictly legal perspective and considers social transformation processes in contexts of conflict-related structural violences and injustices in a broader sense. We are very, very happy to have you all with us, and I would like to now hand over the floor to our first speaker, Jaliwe Clark, who was the interim director of the African Gender Institute and a lecturer in gender studies at the School of African and Gender Studies of the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Since 2000, she has interacted with a wide range of women's rights activists and peace builders and conflict resolution practitioners in over 11 countries on the African continent, such as in her dissertation, Exploring Feminist Notions of Peace in Africa, Experiences of Women Activists in Northern Uganda, where Jaliwe Clark explores feminist theories of peace building that could reshape hegemonic discourses on armed conflict and military engagements. Please.
Thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you for this opportunity. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Yes, thank you for this opportunity to speak on this platform. It's very important to me to speak on this topic to people who think very deeply about questions of peace and security as it relates to gender equality and feminism. And the Women, Peace and Security 1325 is a key, I think, document that has really shaped the way in which internationally this focus on what I would say is feminist analysis of peace and security has been channeled. And so for me, it's really interesting to speak on this platform because I haven't had an opportunity to engage with this kind of community of people in a while, given that I've been quite immersed in undergraduate and postgraduate teaching over the last 10 or so years. So what I'm going to do today is speak to some of the ideas that came forth from my PhD research that Naomi referred to. So between 2012 and 2018, I visited a country in East Africa called Uganda and spent a lot of time with community peace activists in North Uganda who set up peace groups during the height of the militarized conflict in North Uganda, and also during the period that was called the post-conflict reconstruction period. And one of my aims was really to think deeply from the ground up how peace building, peace processes were understood and also theorized by community activists who set up women's peace groups during this period. And one of the ideas was also to think critically about the discourse that is currently prominent globally, especially since the passing of UN Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and to think, to figure out how does this discourse manifest in community groups on the ground that are in militarized contexts, having a focus on questions of femininity, womanhood, and security. And what was interesting about my study, I looked at 5 groups, community-based groups. All but one were formed prior to the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and all but one were set up during the height of the militarized conflict in North Uganda. And so it, of course, their analysis of peace building was informed by partly the discourse, but also there was the possibility that it was their response to the militarized conflict that framed the way in which they engaged with these connections. So what I did was seek to counter what I called liberal feminist discourses that form part of an entangled global coloniality, which is racialized, patriarchal, heteronormative, and Eurocentric at its core. And I think UN Council Resolution 1325 is part of that entanglement, right? So thinking with Heidi Hudson's writing on the critique of liberal peace building, my study sought to embrace a kind of decolonial interpretation of gender and peace building. And this entailed what Hudson called the formulation of tools or strategies that were not only problematized such polarized narratives and relations, but also offer ways of constructing more complex and holistic understandings that are reflective of men and women's everyday life experiences as they cooperate with and resist global oppressions. So a big part of that, in order to do that bottom-up grounded entry into a feminist theorization of peace building, peace and security, I took an approach that decentered the state. So I didn't focus on the governments and the international processes of peace making, if I can call them that, but looked at what it is these 5 groups did in order to foster a process of peace building. And I'm only going to speak to 4 points, theoretical points that I discerned from this long intermittent interaction with these community-based organizations over those 6 to 7 years. One point, in making linkages between feminism and peace building from this particular context and the realities of these five groups, which I don't have time to go into in detail, is that it's important to think about one, ensuring that we always have a nuanced intersectional analysis of women's socioeconomic and political power within militarized contexts. And this requires an understanding of how power works in militarized contexts and how this power is located in women's bodies, networks, and spheres of influence in the communities where peace building interventions are undertaken. And this ensures that women's social positionings, complex positionings, which include race, ethnicity, class, age, location in family, also geographic location in relation to the militarized conflict, that these are understood beyond normative and often homogenized framings of femininity. And that's one of the difficulties with the discourse of women, peace, and security, is it that it assumes that femininity in and of itself is, are uh, essential to peace building processes. But we need to disentangle that assumption, right? And we need to think about and unpack how femininities can be intertwined with processes that are not contributing to peace building as well. And I think these arguments have been made by other scholars. However, it was much more visceral for me during this research process. So this would ensure this attention to women's positioning within the communities they're located in during the militarized spaces. That attention to their complex positionalities would ensure that their power and agency is understood and deliberately centered in social change processes without inadvertently giving undue emphasis to men's realities and their concomitant versions of masculine power. It also ensures that there's no overemphasis on women's vulnerabilities as victims of violence, and that there's an interpretation of different forms of power, and how these intersect with femininities and other uh, factors that are significant to resolving the militarized conflict. The second connection, theoretical connection, that became clear in the research process is that it would be important to understand and draw on local efforts to build peace by paying attention to gendered experiences of survival. So in my study, for example, when I asked the women, why did you set up peace groups just for women? This is before the push, before the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, there was a burgeoning of many women's led and named women peace groups. And consistent across the study was the fact that the their articulation of fractured masculinities, right? And their perspective was that they needed to intervene because masculinities and men were unable to deal with the crisis. And so those fractured masculinities actually expanded women's socioeconomic roles within family networks beyond the usual roles within those communities. And I can't go into that detail now. But that was a important point in terms of thinking about how patriarchal family relationships got subverted as a result of the fractured masculinities and the expanded possibility of influence that the women that I interviewed experienced. I'm just got two more points. The third one was that I think is important is to have an articulation of militarism as a social and economic system that is intertwined with colonial histories of violence, as well as patriarchal values and customs that pitch masculine power as normative. So in the context of Uganda, there was an intertwining of British colonial histories of militarism, influencing and shaping how the conflict unfolded ethnically, and traveled through a masculine militarized identity of power. And so we can't separate our analysis. When we look at the war in North Uganda, we inevitably are having to engage with versions of British militarized masculinities that traveled through the history of Britain's colonial political influences that were big part in shaping the kind of militarized conflict that ensued in North Uganda. The last point is to think about shift in gendered power that need to be taken into account. So especially with regard to markers of socioeconomic and political power. These markers include land and other resources that are central to society's capacity to recreate human security and a sense of social harmony. So these 4 points really came through in the women's interpretation, the people who founded and led and have been active through this period. From about the first group was set up in about 1998, and the last group was set up in 2002, I think, if I remember correctly. The connections that they made as a result of their efforts to create peace at their everyday interaction in families, in the towns that they live in, and in the supporting particularly people who came from the hinterland into the towns that they lived in, sort of their analysis of what the connections were. I managed to sort of discern those 4 important theoretical connections that we need to make. I'm going to end there because I'm sure there'll be much more to discuss. And I couldn't go into the context of Uganda deeply, but I will if need be.
Thank you so much, Yaliwe, for your really valuable analysis of what you've experienced and observed during your dissertation and the work of the women activists in northern Uganda. We will hand over to Helen. I think, as Andrea said, we will have time after the break for a plenary discussion. And whenever there are questions, you can also put them in the chat, and Carla will then come back to them, or we can then come back to them in the plenary. So just let me briefly introduce Helen. Thank you so much, Yaliwe. Helen Scanlon works both as a practitioner and academic on issues of transitional justice, for example, in the framework of the project, which is called Unfinished Business, Disruptive Narratives of South Africa's Abusive Past. This project is intended to promote and support a critical engagement with the fault lines in the implementation of transitional justice in the South African context. Moreover, she is a convener of the Justice and Transformation Program at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and a visiting professor at the United States Stanford University Overseas Study Program. We are very much looking forward to your contribution, Helen, and I hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the organizers for this, and I really, I want to echo Yaliwe. It's such a privilege to be a part of this kind of exchange of information. Just as a point of information, Yaliwe and I wrote a report together nearly 20 years ago on women, peace and security on Resolution 1325. So it's kind of quite interesting being on a platform and reflecting now, nearly 20 years later, really what has been the impact. I mean, I guess it's sort of, it's telling that Yaliwe is still working in this area, that I'm still working in this area, even though we've gone sort of, you know, through various different routes up until now. But the fact is that there's still work to be done, and I think it's really important to learn about the Swiss engagement as well. I had a lot of interesting conversations in the build up to this webinar with the organizers about some of the challenges that Switzerland is facing, and so I'm very interested to explore and hear more about that. I've been asked to do a lot and in very little time. So what I'm just going to do is just very briefly kind of try and speak to some of the themes that the webinar set out to address, and do it through the lens of transitional justice and as was said in the introduction, this specific project that we're working on in South Africa. And I think that sort of one of the things I've come from another meeting this morning, which was looking at the political economy of transitional justice. And I think understanding the political economy of gender, which Yaliwe spoke to as well, of understanding how economic power and power relations underpin conflict and inequalities, that we need to sort of more radically engage with that going forward. I was actually reading something on the Genocide Convention just recently, and about the fact that there's no interrogation of gender power in our understanding of genocide. We focus on the legal aspects that Naomi spoke about, that we shouldn't be doing. You know, that we look at sort of the actual acts of rape, of sexual violence, of biological genocide, but we never actually look at it as a system of power. And I think that's a lot to do again with what Yaliwe spoke to about sort of, you know, who ended up defining these definitions, and in 1948 those definitions come out in the convention, but we reiterated them in 1998 through the Rome Statute, and I think the Women, Peace and Security framework has a lot to do in terms of interrogating a little bit more about some of what we are accepting as international customary law and norms, and we need to interrogate more sort of where power lies within it. I want to just sort of go just very briefly sort of to just actually thinking about, when I'm talking about transitional justice, when we're using it within this context, what we're speaking about. And I think Naomi made this important distinction that we sort of, let's move away from the legal definition. And a lot of the work that I've been doing recently with transitional justice actors on the continent has been very much about trying to disentangle the fact of we've become obsessed with processes. We've become obsessed with what we talk about, the 4 pillars. So criminal justice, truth recovery, reparative justice, reform of abusive institutions. And then these become sort of the entire focus that we have on transitional justice. And within that, only a very specific focus on gender has ever been achieved. And that focus has tended to be the one that we see reproduced in the Women, Peace and Security framework, which is one that almost exclusively focuses on ideas of women as victims of sexual violence, women as victims of male perpetrators, and also solutions being women's representation. But within this, never really looking at what are we trying to achieve? What is our end goal? And that's why a lot of practitioners have been talking more and more about the need to actually revisit what are our normative aims for transitional justice? What is the outcome for societies that we're trying to achieve? And where have we gone wrong through our focus on processes rather than looking at the societies, as I said, that we want to see a transformation to? And I think that South Africa is a place that has a lot of lessons that can be learned in terms of the huge failures that we can see that we are facing in 2023. And I've just pulled this out just in terms of sort of just to really sort of identify some of the bigger issues that we're dealing here with. First of all, that South Africa's got the highest Gini coefficient in the world. It's the most unequal society in the world, and inequality has actually increased since 1994. If we look at the economic realities of the country, that Oxfam found that a platinum mine worker would have to work for 93 years to earn the average CEO's official annual bonus. Their bonus, not their income, their bonus. In 2022, our employment hit 34%. And quite critically, I see Laseko is in the audience here, who's a recent graduate. Unemployment amongst 15 to 24-year-olds here is 66%. Key indicators of poverty for the African population are equal or worse than those in poorer countries in Africa. Violence against women, and this is sort of to talk to what the issues raised in this webinar, is the highest of any country not in conflict. There is the highest rate of femicide in the world. And when we're talking about this inequality in society, we're talking about it being stratified on race and gender lines. So if South Africa has been this poster child for transitional justice in many ways, the ideation of what transitional justice can do to bring about what people say reconciliation, why are we sitting with the statistics that we are now? And I think one of the issues that, as I mentioned, we are dealing with in my my transitional justice project, which is around called Unfinished Business, is working with the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, who are trying to actually push the fact that this transition is not over. This transition is not over for women. The aftermath still continues, and that a lot of the promises of transitional justice still remain to be realized. And part of this project is we've been looking at how do we look at different methodologies to talk about the past? In what way can we communicate to generations now who are dealing with a lot of intergenerational trauma, but may not necessarily equate their experiences right now with this historic experiences? And Yeliwe did a very helpful job of mapping in the Ugandan context about sort of how the past of colonization continues to inform the present, and that manifests in terms of masculinities. And South Africa's got a very similar situation in terms of, the legacies of 400 years of colonialism and apartheid. But all of those systems which are structured on specific ideas around gender and sexuality, there were huge controls over issues of both race and gender by apartheid, because that is how the system was maintained, through having specific ideas of masculinities, particularly white masculinities and white femininities, and then reinforcing that through laws which created strict laws about termination of pregnancies for the white population, yet enforced sterilization for the Black population. So specific attempts to try and control gender and sexuality for a particular project, none of which has actually been dealt with. And one of the issues, as I said, this project that I was involved with earlier today was about political economy, and an issue that recurs and constantly comes up with South Africa. The reason why we are the most unequal society in the world is entrenched in the transition, where all that was dealt with was violations of political and civil rights, with no attempt to address the socio-economic underpinnings of those systems. And those are the issues that we continue to deal with today. So the project that we're working on in terms of different methodologies is looking at the creation of podcasts, the creation of cartoons, and the use of art in order to start looking at different ways to highlight frustrations that people feel with the unaddressed issues of the past. And that that we've done through highlighting 2 stories. I can make this all available. We have a podcast, 3 podcasts, which focuses on the story of Nokutula Simelane. Nokutula Simelane was a woman who disappeared in 1983. She was part of the MK, the anti-apartheid movement, underground. And since 1983, her family have been trying to locate her remains. At the moment, there are 2 perpetrators, 2 people who admitted to being involved in her disappearance, who are in court. One of them is claiming that he now has dementia, and the trial may collapse as a result. But we're talking now 40 years after her disappearance that there has been no justice for her family. And so we've produced a cartoon series and this a 3-part podcast series, which looks at Tembi, her sister's attempt to try and get justice. And Tembi has been even offered the perpetrators that she won't pursue the criminal justice route if they just tell her mother where the remains are, because they wish to bury her before her mother dies, her mother's now 81. So the cartoon is called A Tale of Two Sisters. So it's trying to link the past and the present, and how quest for justice continues in the present. And on this slide, you can see on the top left-hand corner, it's actually a statue that was put up in Bethel in Mpumalanga, which was erected by the local government to commemorate Nokutulu. A lot of people question what it means to put up a statue in the absence of the body and the absence of returning her remains. But within less than 2 years of the statue being created, 2 white local farmers put a rope around the neck and pulled the statue down. And Tembi, the sister, said it was actually, even in her disappearance, there is no dignity. So we see a lot of the reproduction of violence towards a statue that she experienced in life, but no justice being provided either by those who perpetrated the crime, but also the current dispensation that we have in South Africa. The other part of the project is, sorry, I'm just trying to get into the next slide, is we've featured Nomarasha Bonase, and Nomarasha is a human rights activist. Tembi is in a deputy minister, she's in government right now, and even being in government, she has no power and influence over justice for her sister. Nomarasha is a human rights activist who has been critical both in sort of campaigning in the immediate aftermath of apartheid for reparations for victims, particularly for women. She became involved in the Marikana massacre. I don't know if people know about it, but the Marikana massacre in 2012 was a case where 34 unarmed miners were shot down by the police force here. Nomarasha was integral in trying to get reparations for the wives of these miners. And Nomarasha has been part of a campaign recently, which is outside our constitutional court in Johannesburg. On the left-hand side, you can see this is the flame of freedom that was put outside the constitutional court, which was meant to be a sign of never again in South Africa would we have the violence of the past. The women have used the court as a specific site, and next to the freedom flame to highlight the fact that reparations has still not been achieved in South Africa, that there was only a limited interpretation of who should get reparations in the immediate post-apartheid, post-TRC period, and that reparations remain something that is critical particularly for women in South Africa. So not saying in any way that this will address many of the legacies of the past that we're dealing with, but they firmly argued, and I think it's in one of the posters maybe that we can't see here, that gender-based violence is an ongoing justice issue in South Africa, and something that there should be reparative justice for, and that needs to be identified. So in terms of the South African context, we are dealing with a very unfinished process. We're dealing with a country which has in some ways created a very particular version of what has happened for external sources in terms of our transitional justice project. But there's a very strong and increasingly vocal attempt by transitional justice activists to ensure that those promises that were made are realized, and that within this, the silences that existed around gender-based violence are addressed in some, if only by acknowledgement. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Helen, for presenting us with this, this history or this legacy within the South African context of silences and gaps in the acknowledgement of realities around the apartheid system, but also the process of transitioning from it, or the unfinished process of transition. I think it leaves us with many things to think about and to also include in our thoughts about the term transitional justice. I would like now to hand over to Izabel, our last expert speaker of today. Izabel Barros has studied history and is active in different projects in the Swiss context. For example, one that is called the Living Room, which is a community center in the central district of Bern. The space facilitates dialogue between artists, activists, and the neighborhood to create a unique space where connections and can happen and unheard stories can be told. Since July of the past year of 2022, she's a PhD candidate at the Centre d'Histoire Internationale et d'Études Politiques de la Mondialisation at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, where she conducts research on Swiss colonial history in relation to Brazil, focusing on narratives from the margins, historiography, and archival documents from both sides of the Atlantic. The floor is yours, Izabel.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. Such a big responsibility to talk now. So once again, good morning, Yaliwi, Helen, Naomi, Andrea, Carla, and all the friends who are listening to us from far and from near. Thank you a lot for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to build together this experience of temporary community on the same issues or on similar issues. As well, thank you for the interpreters that are allowing us to cross another barrier, that's the language barrier, and as well to all the anonymous characters that are taking care of the people that we love, so we can take part of this moment. I would like to begin my talk by a little anecdote that's very emblematic for me. So when I arrived in Switzerland from Brazil almost like 18 years ago, I arrived very young. I was a young history student who wanted to write a research project on religious war in Switzerland. Yeah, I know it's not the sexiest thematic ever, but I really wanted to. Because this subject caught my attention since Brazil in the early 2000s was going through a new process. I observed the rise of religion in new Pentecostal churches, the resurgence of religious racism against religions of African descent, and a certain disdain for those two groups that I just mentioned by the Catholic elite. At the same time, the theology of liberation, probably lots of people know, that is the progressive wing of the Catholic Church, was losing the space it had achieved with the redemocratization of Brazil. So I saw those conflicts everywhere, even in my own family. And this intensification of these positions can regrettably still be felt today, especially on Bolsonaro's election. Exactly at that time, when I was living these issues, I learned that in Switzerland, differently from what happened in the neighbor countries as France and Germany, the cantons, so the states, voted for their official religion. So people chose, of course, the bourgeoisie, the rich people chose if they wanted to be officially Catholic or Protestant. Sure, there was a war of religion in Switzerland by the time. I'm talking about, some 16th century. But there was a war of religion then, but it was much less violent than the ones who happened in France with the Saint Barthélemy and in Germany with Luther's massacre, where thousands and thousands of people died. Okay, later I learned that it was not quite like that, but that's another story. And I really wanted to research that. I was really interested to know, like, wow, Switzerland found a solution. So I want to see what did they found. So I was looking for a professor to guide me in this research, and the responsible of the modern history department quickly made me understand that because I was not Swiss, I was not European, I should look to a research project closer to me. I should, for instance, approach Latin American issue, for example. That unmotivated me in my research. And I found myself wondering, like, wow, during my whole education in Brazil, everything I have heard, I read, I have learned in history, and about the history of my own country, was seen through the eyes of French, German, English, and North American naturalists, scientists, academics, and so on. So why it was not possible for me and for other people like me to write an European history, and why a subject that was so close to me was suddenly very distant. And my university academic disappointments never stopped then. So when I studied history of democracy here in Switzerland, no one talked about the Haitian Revolution, the most democratic revolution of its time. In the history of mondialization or globalization, if you want, all the authors and the bibliography that were given to us were or European or North American, men especially. And when talking about peace promotion, nobody gave me the example of the commitment of Liberian women for peace and how they were the ones who ended the civil war in their country. All that to say that this practice of invisibilization of experiences is a colonial practice. And this is the central message of what I came to share with you today. Colonialism is not over, but neither is completely successful, thankfully. So Switzerland, the country where I'm living, and like all other European countries, actively participated in the colonial project, contributed to its maintenance, and participated in its continuities. I can be talking about it, their missionaries, naturalists, mercenaries, plantation owners, traders in the 19th century that are the object of my study, or talking today about coffee trading market as home base for Glencore, Monsanto, and other big companies. In spite of believing to be isolated and an exception, Switzerland has been connected and interconnected, and that was globally and for centuries. These interconnections go through important power relations, performances, practices, and agendas that have to be questioned if we want to build a common future. I want to give you an example because sometimes I use the word performance and it's not as clear. When I talk about colonial performance, I stop to accompany indigenous communities, human rights and environmental rights defenders that came from Brazil to Switzerland for those big meetings in the UN, because I was really tired of seeing elderly Guaranis, Guajajara, Awa community leaders, and in situations of conflict being forced to reduce their pay in 6 minutes of speech. Their communities and their supporters have to spend a lot of money on the last minute planes or accommodation because the UN releases their agenda a few weeks before the meeting, when it's not some days before the meeting. People are then far from their communities and they are exposed to violence on the way to Europe and on the way that they go back to Europe. Unfortunately, to abdicate to this procedure could have very bad consequences for human rights and environmental rights defenders. By the way, in Brazil, indigenous communities, they don't differentiate human rights and environmental rights defenders because it's the same thing. But anyway, by dividing the world in global South and global North, we forget that there is a lot of South in the North and a lot of North in the South. And I'm not only talking here about the natural resources from the South that are traded in the North. I'm talking about the 25% of migrants that cannot vote in Switzerland and the 1% of the elites in Brazil who have the same wealth as more than half of the population. And I think Helen was as well talking about that. We use these conventions that again make people invisible and hide the plurality of discourses and experiences that may give us the big picture of reality and the instruments to deal with this reality. Making accessible decision-making environments and making visible previously marginalized experiences are not simply part of a plan for historical justice. Those experiences are exactly beauty, strength, and potential that show us another experience of community. I had the opportunity while working for CFD, the Feminist Peace Organization, this is co-organizing this event, to read the South African National Action Plan 1325. It may not be perfect for you, Helen, I imagine, because it's never perfect for the civil society, and it shouldn't be. Otherwise, we're not doing our work correctly. But it's far, far more progressive than what we have here in Switzerland. Despite the important challenge that we have in Switzerland regarding women's participating in conflict prevention, peace promotion, and the fight against SGBV, the action plan we develop here are pretty more oriented abroad than home. So as I said, it ignores all the parts of South in the North that we have here in Switzerland. As we all know, it's not only the absence of war and direct violence that defines peace. It includes a dignified life in which all people participate fully in the society they live in, where people are recognized culturally, economically, politically. Therefore, I look very much forward for this moment of exchange with you. And I would just like to maybe to wrap up and to resume a bit like our 3 points, because I learned a lot. I did a lot of notes when you were both talking. So I think in all the cases that we are mentioning, reparations are still an unfinished processes, and in all of them, we are questioning these colonial continuities and wanting to deconstruct these conventions, those big names that have empty behind, and maybe the way to do that is to think in a transactional, intertwining, and intersectional way, and finally acknowledgement, finding justice in this transactional way. I would like to thank you so much for everything. Thanks for your patience as well. And I look forward for the discussion later.
Thank you so much, Izabel, for your talk, but also for wrapping up all of the 3 talks so beautifully. Thank you for reminding us that what Bill Hooks calls the margins is equally visible in the center, and the center is visible in the margins, so-called south and north is on both sides of the pole, or the poles, they change depending on the perspectives. I think this is such an important message, also when it comes to the narratives of justice, injustice, violence, the meanings of peace and conflict.